The knock came at sundown, when the wind ran low across the high grasses and the world felt like it held its breath. Beau McCrae, whose boots had carried him through loss and silence alike, heard it as he was oiling the hinges of the barn gate. He didn't startle, just paused, the oilkin frozen mid-pour, as if that quiet knock had risen from a dream he wasn't sure he'd asked to remember. He straightened, set the can down, and walked slow toward the porch, where the last of the day's amber light stretched across the floorboards like spilled honey. The woman stood at the edge of it, her bonnet pulled low, a child behind her so still she seemed part of her shadow. Dust clung to both of them, the kind that comes not from a single journey, but from a life of leaving. "I was told you need a cook," the woman said, her voice dry but even, like a creek long since drained. Her dress was faded blue, patched at the elbow and pinned at the hip, and her hands trembled just enough to notice if you were the noticing kind. Beau looked at her, then down at the little girl who clutched her mother's skirt with pale fingers. The child's hair was a tumble of prairie curls, her eyes too large, too wary. She didn't speak, just stared at him like she expected something to go wrong. He didn't answer right away. Words were things he used sparingly, like coffee or matches in winter. Instead, he stepped aside and nodded once. The woman hesitated only a breath, then guided the girl in ahead of her. She moved like someone used to earning her place with silence and sweat. Inside, the ranch house bore the look of a life halted mid-step. The furniture was clean, the floorboards swept, but there was no color, no smell of bread or wood smoke, nothing that told of life being lived. Beau pointed toward the kitchen with a small motion of his hand, and the woman nodded. She unpacked a small tin of lard, a threadbare sack of flour, and one onion. From the pantry, she found what she needed without asking: canned beans, dried chili, a jar of salt. Beau watched from the doorway, arms folded, as she moved about the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had cooked in kitchens not her own. The girl sat in the corner, legs tucked beneath her, watching. She didn't fidget, didn't speak. Just kept those eyes steady, pinned to her mother like she was afraid if she blinked, she'd vanish. Beau thought of his own wife, 3 winters gone now. He'd buried her under the cottonwood tree past the fence line, where the wind still curled around the stone he carved with his own knife. He hadn't let anyone else cook in that kitchen since. The woman stirred the pot without looking up. "My name's Clara," she said quietly, like it mattered to her that he know but not enough to force it on him. He nodded again. "Beau." They said no more. The sun dipped behind the hills as the scent of cornbread began to bloom in the air, warm, spiced, like something long forgotten. Beau hadn't known how much he missed the sound of a spoon scraping the sides of a pot. The clatter of dishes. A woman humming low beneath her breath. They ate in silence. Clara served him first, then the child, then herself. "Ellie," she said softly when introducing her daughter. The girl didn't respond, didn't even glance up, but Beau offered her a small piece of buttered cornbread, and she took it with hands that trembled just slightly. Afterward, Clara washed the dishes without asking where the towels were. She dried them slow, careful, like each plate carried a story she didn't want to smudge. Beau leaned against the doorframe and said nothing. When the oil lamp was lit and the fire low, Clara turned to him. "We'll be gone in the morning if it's trouble," she said, brushing her damp hands down her apron. Didn't mean to impose. Beau stared at her for a long moment. There was something in her voice, tired but not defeated. A woman who'd been told more than once she wasn't wanted and had learned to leave before the words were spoken. "Supper's at 6, he said finally, and walked out to the porch. That night the wind picked up again. Beau sat in the rocker his wife once favored and watched the moon rise slow. He could hear Clara moving inside, the soft hush of bedding being laid, the tiny cough of a child fighting sleep. He let the sound settle in him like the last sips of whiskey. In town the next day, he heard the first ripple of talk. Mrs. Whitcomb, loud as ever at the mercantile, declared that a strange woman and child were spotted at the McCrae ranch. No husband, no past, and she just walks in like she belongs. Beau said nothing. He paid for his flour and left with the bag tucked under one arm, jaw tight. When he returned, Clara was hauling water from the well. Her sleeves were rolled, arms thin but strong, and the child was barefoot chasing chickens in the dust. She paused when she saw him, uncertain, like she expected news she wouldn't like. "Town's talking," he said evenly, setting the flour on the porch rail. Clara nodded. "They always do." He watched her then, trying to find the fear, but she stood tall. Not proud, just anchored. "I can go," she offered again, quieter this time. Beau's eyes went to the girl, who now stood behind her mother again, her face unreadable. "You cook like someone who's stayed hungry too long," he said. "And that girl's got the same eyes my wife did when she first came west." Clara's lips parted, but no sound came out. He picked up the flour again and opened the door. "Supper's still at 6. By the end of the week, something shifted. Clara began humming louder. Ellie, still silent, began placing small stones on the porch rail every morning, one by one, in a neat row. Beau left a blanket folded at the foot of their cot. Clara mended one of his shirts and set it by the hearth. It was small, all of it, but it felt like rain hitting dry ground. One evening, Beau found the old photograph of his wife tucked into a drawer. He looked at it a while, her smile faint, fading at the edges, then set it gently beneath a stack of old letters. At supper, he noticed wildflowers in a tin cup beside his plate. Clara glanced up and said, almost too softly, "I don't think anyone's ever brought me flowers before." Beau didn't respond. He just looked at the flowers, then at the girl, then back at Clara. The air between them felt like something waiting to bloom. The morning came soft and silver, the kind of light that doesn't promise anything, just shows up gentle, asking nothing in return. Clara stood at the stove, hands red from pump water, stirring a pot of beans with a steady rhythm. Ellie sat on the floor nearby, tracing circles in the dust with a twig, still not speaking, still watching everything with those eyes that missed nothing. Beau had gone to town at dawn. He hadn't said why, only tipped his hat and saddled up, his silhouette fading into the haze like a chapter she wasn't sure she belonged in. Clara stood longer at the window after he left, rubbing her knuckles, fighting the urge to run again before she was told to. The knock came not long after. 2 sharp raps at the door, curt, entitled. Clara knew before she opened it that it wasn't kindness waiting outside. Mrs. Whitcomb didn't step back when Clara opened the door. She was flanked by 2 other women, sharp-faced and smelling of starch and contempt. The one on the left carried a basket of stale bread, but it wasn't a gift, it was a statement. Clara didn't reach for it. "Well," Mrs. Whitcomb began, glancing past her shoulder into the dim house, "we thought we'd come by, see who's taken up residence at the McCrae ranch." Clara said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she'd learned the price of speaking to women who only asked questions to hear themselves echo. The second woman spoke up. "They say you came from El Paso. That you were working at a saloon, some say worse." "I cooked," Clara said simply. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" Mrs. Whitcomb laughed, the kind of laugh that doesn't need agreement to wound. The silence stretched long. Ellie had crept to the doorway behind her, barefoot and small, her hand finding the hem of Clara's apron. Clara stepped slightly in front of her, shielding the child as instinctively as breath. "You don't belong here," the third woman muttered, eyes narrowed. "Men like Beau McCrae don't need women with ghosts trailing behind them." Clara met her gaze. "Then let the man tell me that himself." They left the bread on the porch rail, turned and walked off in a clump of disapproval and dust. Clara didn't watch them go. She shut the door slowly and locked it, though she knew locks weren't worth much against words already loosed into town. That night, Beau returned with a sack of grain and a leather-bound book under his arm. He looked at her face, then at the untouched food on the table, then at the silence hanging thicker than usual. She didn't speak, just turned and lit another lamp, as if she could push back the night with flame alone. "They came," he said finally. She nodded, her hands folded so tightly in front of her they had gone white at the knuckles. I never lied, she said. I just never had a place where truth didn't break the windows. Bo set the book down on the table. Tell me now. She didn't cry. Not yet. She told it straight. About the saloon kitchen, about the owner with his hands and his threat. About the fire she set not to hurt but to scare. About how it caught too fast. About leaving in the night with Ellie in her arms and Ash still clinging to her sleeve. About how silence became survival, and how no town ever truly forgot what it thought it knew. When she was done, she looked at him like she expected the door to open behind her again, like she'd already memorized the path back to nowhere. Bo didn't speak for a long time. Then he reached across the table and poured her a cup of water. His hands didn't shake. He slid it to her gently, like offering peace instead of judgment. Grief, he said, makes us burn things we never meant to. Makes ghosts of the living and walls out of skin. Clara lowered her eyes. I don't want to bring trouble to your doorstep. You already did, he replied. And I've been more alive in the last week than the 3 years before you knocked. Ellie, who had been sitting quiet at the hearth, stood slowly. Her fingers clutched a small rag doll Clara had sewn from scrap. She walked over to Bo, stopping just short of his knee. She looked up, uncertain, as if asking something without the language to say it. He crouched down, resting on one knee. You okay, little one? He asked. She leaned forward and whispered, barely audible. Papa. It landed like a gunshot in the still air, but instead of pain, it left something open, something unguarded. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her shoulders trembling as if every ounce of holding it together had just let go. Bo didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply opened his arms, slow and sure, and the girl stepped into them like she'd been waiting a lifetime to feel safe. They stayed that way a long while, until the fire burned low and the room dimmed. The next Sunday they rode into town together. Clara wore her hair braided and pinned, her spine straight. Ellie wore a hand-sewn dress and held Bo's hand, tight and proud. The street grew quiet as they passed. Gossip paused mid-sentence, hung in the air, then fizzled into silence. At the church steps, Mrs. Whitcomb stood with her fan twitching in her fingers. Bo nodded politely. Ma'am, he said, voice clear, reckon folks talk when their own homes feel too quiet. But mine ain't any more. He didn't wait for her reply. That evening, back at the ranch, the kitchen glowed with warmth. Silas joked about how he'd better start learning to sew if this place was turning domestic. Clara laughed soft and real, like a window cracked open after a long storm. Bo carved a new name into the bench out front. Not hers, not Ellie's. Just one word, home. Later, when the dishes were done and the stars were out in their old familiar places, Clara stepped onto the porch where Bo was sitting, whittling as always. You sure about this? She asked, her voice thin from something that wasn't fear anymore, but hope. He didn't answer at first. Just looked up at her, steady. I'm sure, he said. And if you ever doubt it again, I'll just keep saying it until you believe it. The wind shifted, and somewhere inside, Ellie began to hum, off-key and sweet. Sometimes it turns out a door knocks back. Sometimes it opens wide enough to let in what was missing all along.